Hello everyone and welcome back to the OverSeers. My name's Proilios and I'm joined as usual by my co-host Nightwing, and we are rolling into week 4 of the Overwatch League Season 5 this Thursday, and we are pretty hyped to talk about a lot of different things this week. We got to watch our first few APAC games this past weekend, which were super entertaining for me as well as Nightwing. And I want to get your thoughts on this, Nightwing. How do you think the APAC region compares to the NA region right now? Not just in terms of meta, but just in terms of the average skill level of both regions.
I think there's two ways to look at it. You can compare the bottoms of each region, and you can compare the tops of each region. I think the bottom of APAC is probably significantly better than the bottom of NA, for sure. Teams like probably the Guangzhou Charge and the LA Valiant, even if they are, defaulting to those Zarya comps, which might be broken down a little bit by those, Winston comps, they're still overall, it's on an individual level, they're better than teams like the Vancouver Titans. So I think the bottom of APAC is definitely better. I think for the top of APAC, I think it's a bit harder to compare. Uh, you can see that teams like the Shock have been, doing really well with the Winston comp over in NA. And again, that has been something that the Philly Fusion have also been doing with the Belisaria on the Winston. And Fury sometimes coming in for maps like New Queen Street for the Zarya. So, teams that have been doing well, like the Philly Fusion in the APAC region, could be comparable to the teams that are doing well in the NA region, such as the Shock. But I think it's hard to tell. And unfortunately, we won't really get an answer for that in this first kickoff clash tournament because it's a regional tournament. That said, I think both teams definitely show like the best that each region has to offer, and I think it's pretty high level of version in both of them, really, uh, to the point where the Dynasty seems, I mean, the Shanghai Dragons seems to have dropped off a little bit comparatively. So I think really good gameplay coming out from the top of both regions, but overall, just in terms of the average team, I would say the APAC region is a bit stronger.
That's quite an interesting argument because I think overall there's not a giant difference in the overall level of play between both regions. But I was actually thinking that the NA region is edging a little bit ahead just because I think the highest level of play in NA is currently higher than that of APAC. Not by a lot, but like I think if you just map out like create a power rankings at this point of the entire league, I think the top five out of the top five spots, probably the top four would be in the NA region. Like there's one team I do have in mind which would be in the top five overall from APAC, which I'll talk about in a bit. But I think in general, the NA region is edging ahead. The sample size is definitely quite like in NA's favor right now because we've just seen 1 week of APAC and 3 weeks of NA. So I think this is bound to change as we head into the next week of play. But this is just my first impression. I think the metas are definitely quite different. You see APAC playing a lot more Ash and Echo, for example, whereas you see NA playing a lot more of the Winston dive. You see those Zarya comps on both sides, but not so much in NA. You see like a lot more Zarya Reaper and the Ash Echo in the APAC region. So yeah, it's going to be a bit interesting to compare this going into like next week as well. I think after watching the 12 APAC games that we have set for us, we'll get a much better idea of which the better region is. But let's now move on and just reflect a little bit on what happened in week 3 and start off by talking about our biggest winners. Um, from both the regions, we could pick any one. So, personally, I thought the Philadelphia Fusion were the biggest winners of week 3. And like this team finally has my stamp of approval. I was really worried that like for the Fusion, the support line of Fixer and Aim God would hold this team back, and because of that, they would struggle to get wins against even some of the middling teams in the APAC region. But so far, the backline has been doing okay, and as a result, they've been able to provide a lot more resources to the tanks and to the supports and to the DPS, and you can really see that because MN3 and Zest, who are their kind of starting DPSs for the most part, have been popping the heck off, and like both of them had such amazing debut showings, and even going into the second game, they just like showed a lot of versatility, a lot of amazing mechanics, and showed a lot of like kind of rookie of the year potential, I would say. And they are definitely the best team in APAC going into week 4, and at least as of week 3, I think the best team that we saw. So that's my winner. What about yours, Nightwing?
I think you definitely make a very good point about the Philly Fusion, and I agree with most of those points, honestly, especially with them 3-0ing the Shanghai Dragons, who literally just won the previous season of the Overwatch League. So, a great showing from the Philly Fusion. My biggest winner probably would have to be the Dallas Fuel this week, just because I think overall they're probably the strongest team so far. Uh, Despite the shock probably having a better actual record in the standings, uh, because currently I think the Dallas Fuel are sort of playing at their own tempo, and uh, the kind of compositions that Coach Rush is making work for his team are not really applicable to like anyone else. I think Edison's finally up and running properly. They put in Doha for a little bit, which is very interesting, and I think the Dallas Fuel overall is probably just a more solid team, especially with some doubts creeping in now that you've seen the shock play against a team like the Gladiators, where they almost lost but then managed to pull off a reverse sweep, which was very fun but quite concerning if you're, someone on the SF shock. Uh, so I think overall the most solid level of play in the NA region was probably the Dallas Fuel, and that's why they're my winner. I think that's pretty much as cut and dry as it can get.
Hmm. And what about your biggest loser for week 3? So I think we had a lot of disappointing showings this past week because there were a lot of one-sided games as we expected. So I'm interested to know what you thought of the losing teams last week.
So I think my biggest loser, it's like a bit of a toss-up between multiple teams. To be honest, I think uh, even teams like the Boston Uprising, as we'll talk about later, have some strange issues surrounding them. But I think my biggest loser has to probably be the Chengdu Hunters, just because they've scaled down that roster, and I think that's really starting to hurt them where it counts. They were able to secure a victory against the Guangzhou Charge, but then they got absolutely destroyed by their second matchup, which was, I believe, the Seoul Dynasty. And they just did not show up in this game at all, in my opinion. I don't think they really had a good idea going with where to place Gaga or Daisy in that second game. And considering how high people had them, and considering the sort of brain drain that has happened with the loss of talent, I think this team really needs to go back to the drawing board and figure out what to do. Uh, I would almost play the Shanghai Dragons here because they did get 3-0 by Philly. But the fact of the matter is that Shanghai Dragons gameplay still look much better than the Chengdu Hunters. Obviously, there are objectively worse teams like the Guangzhou Charge, but there's only so much I can harp on them because they only have a limited amount of talent. Whereas I think the amount of disappointment that comes out from Chengdu is probably uh, much higher than some of these other teams.
Hmm. And I'm gonna throw in a bit of a span in the works here. Uh, Personally, my biggest loser for week 3 was the NYXL. And this might seem confusing to a lot of you because the NYXL only had to really rally their troops once this week, whereas there were other teams that played twice or thrice. But I think the NYXL was sort of that team for me, which could have been like relatively middling throughout the league. Like when like okay, let me put it this way: when the APAC teams were out of the picture, the NYXL seemed like they could be a decent team overall, even like even after we would have had seen the APAC teams play, right? But I think now that we've seen these APAC teams rolling out on their different lineups, playing these different compositions, getting wins against a lot of different teams in their region, it's pretty evident that the NYXL are actually quite unimpressive, even like compared to like almost every team in the APAC region. I feel like they, if they were still in APAC, they would be at the bottom of the APAC region. Maybe the like I think the LA Valiant would probably be the only team that they would kind of have a tie with in terms of the standings. But other than that, like they've just like but gone to near the bottom of the board for me, and I wouldn't have thought of them so like negatively if I hadn't seen these APAC teams playing this week. Because I felt like teams, like the Paris Eternal, like the Vancouver Titans, they were quite evidently at the bottom of the league standings in terms of skill level, in terms of power levels. But the NYXL could have been some in a more impressive spot. So like the showing of these APAC teams, and also the fact that the NYXL lost pretty brutally in a matchup against the Florida Mayhem this week, just kind of makes them like my pick for the biggest losing team of week 3. So yeah, I think on that note, let's move on to some roster moves that happened in this past week. Starting off with the NYXL actually signing Gesture as an assistant coach. And we didn't see this signing coming by any stretch of our imagination. But yes, the NYXL have signed the ex Seoul Dynasty main tank player Gesture to be the assistant coach. And Gesture is one of those kind of greatest of all time players in professional Overwatch, right? We've known him since like we've known him for a long time. Like the not only the past 4 years of the Overwatch League, but also before that, where he was just grinding in the professional scene down in Korea. So, with a lot of veteran experience, he's kind of entering the NYXL atmosphere. It's a fully Korean lineup. The coaching staff is fully Korean, but it is his first coaching experience. So, I don't really know what to think of this signing because I'm generally not a big fan of uh, like players being signed as coaches, but at least he's not being put in a head coach position, kind of like Toby. So he has a chance to grow here, really understand his strengths when it comes to coaching players, and I think he'll find a good niche in the NYXL and maybe improve their gameplay in certain ways. And what are your thoughts on this signing, Nightwing?
I think it's really funny how so many main tanks are being picked up for the coaching position. You've got Miro and the Hangzhou Spark as well. And you've obviously got, the NYXL's own head coach, Kuki, who was a main tank as well at some point. So I think it's just really hilarious how that transition is happening. However, I think, if Kuki sees something in them, maybe there's something that can be made out of him. It's just slightly unlikely, I feel, because I feel like the Gesture has never had the best read on the meta. His swaps have been questionable throughout his time as a player, and that's all you can really judge him on, right? Obviously, Gesture does understand the intricacies of characters like Winston, and his flexibility on heroes like the Hog also showed that he had a deep understanding of each individual hero. However, I feel like a lot of blame for Soul's failings come due to the sort of weird picks that Jester would go off to at times. And obviously, some of that is attributed to the coaching staff of the Soul Dynasty when he played over there and the London Spitfire. But I feel like Jester never really mastered sort of working together as a team compared to some of these other players. And that's why I feel like his role as a coach might be probably best limited to just helping Kellen improve as an individual tank player. Though I'm not even sure how that will directly translate into Overwatch 2. So I think it's a little bit questionable, but hopefully we're able to see Kellen improve because I think we have seen that Kellen is struggling slightly. I would probably be a lot more comfortable if Jester was signed as a player coach, similar to the thing that was done with Jake in the Houston Outlaws, despite how controversial that move was. just because I think Kellen could use a backup. Um, as a assistant coach, though, I'm not really sure what Jester can provide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very fair points. I think it just remains to be seen, honestly, if this team's tank play or kind of any sort of play improves after Gesture's signing. Uh, all right, let's talk about the more interesting piece of news that we had, and it dropped quite recently, actually. So the Boston Uprising have released Marvel from their roster, and Huck put out this post. Like, Huck is the president of the Boston Uprising. He put out a statement saying that he had to leave, like Marvel had to leave the team because of personal issues, despite the fact that the Uprising staff kind of worked with him to solve some of those issues. But for his well-being, he needs to go back to Korea, and they're just parting ways in quite a positive way, because they like Huck has praised him for his like leadership skills and his professionalism. So I hope Marvel gets whatever he needs to get sorted, you know, sorted, and we wish him the very best from the overseers. But yeah, I think before we talk about the second kind of aspect to this, I want to get your thoughts on Marvel Nightwing.
Yeah, I think Marvel has always shown himself to be a very coachable player, honestly, because he quietly accepted being designated the Sigma one trick spot for the Soul Dynasty when he was on that team, and he played that to quite a good degree. And then he comes into Overwatch 2 playing a pretty solid Doom and probably better than what you'd actually expect out of him. I think the team definitely had some weaknesses on that comp, but you could see that Marvel, even though he was struggling with a lot of these issues, as Huck has described in his statement, despite all that, on a gameplay level and on team coordination level, Marvel was probably the most solid tank that the Boston Uprising had, if I'm being honest. Despite the recent successes without him, uh, I think Marvel provided a good deal of flexibility and innovation almost to the Boston Uprising's gameplay style. Because I was genuinely impressed by the Doomfist that Marvel played, even if it wasn't, up to the level of Hawk or Dante. And I think that is really saying something about like how coachable and how adaptable and just how passionate for the game Marvel is. I hope he's able to sort these issues out and come into maybe a lower seeded roster. I would love for Marvel to be given a shot, maybe even on the NYXL itself or one of these other sort of lower seeded teams. I could even maybe see him like get a decent spot on the Vancouver Titans, even though that might not be the best transition for him as a Korean player. I think he definitely has potential, and I would love for him to sort of get another starting spot soon.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite sad. Like he has to head back to Korea for. I mean, we don't know the reasons behind it, but I do think that he could get into like almost any APAC team if he like if his skill set is really required. I think there are teams that could definitely use his skill set. Like I feel like he could slot in fairly well alongside the Guangzhou Charge, because you can see Rio having some issues on the main tank role over there as he has for the past couple of years. But anyway, we are not going to delve too much into that. We just kind of hope that whichever roster he's injected into next, if at all, is kind of a better fit for him. Because I always felt that his signing onto the Boston Uprising was a little bit like a bit of a mismatch. But yeah, along with this though, because Marvel's kind of departure from the Boston Uprising was teased by Halo early on his Twitter account. He also mentioned that Striker would be leaving the team, which is very interesting because Huck also dropped another tweet um, saying that something along the lines of no single player is greater than the entire team or something like that. I'll either display this tweet on the screen or like add it to the description somewhere. Uh, but presumably, like Striker has struck some sort of chord with the team, and it's not a very pleasant chord. And this is kind of similar to the situation that we had with the San Francisco Shock last year, where there was some issue within the team, especially between Striker and Glister, because Glister was getting more playtime. Or was that Tayo? I think it was Tayo. But because of that, Striker seemingly departed from the San Francisco Shock, and it seems to be kind of a similar situation with the Boston Uprising right now. And honestly, like modesty doesn't seem to be Striker's strong suit, because if like if what we are reading from this situation is true, he kind of just wants a starting spot, which quite frankly there's no harm in giving him that because he has proven to be a really good player. But I feel if Coach Lowry is deciding on certain player rotations, there has to be a good reason for that, because Lowry isn't like a rookie either. He's quite an experienced coach, has won multiple seasons of contenders with WGS Phoenix. So I'm not really sure what's going on there, but I think there's just a lot of speculation at this point, and yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how things proceed from here, and if we actually get a statement from Huck regarding this as well.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, it is a lot of speculation, but you can definitely see some sort of pattern emerging where in their most recent match, I don't think Striker was played at all. It was just Victoria and Valentine. And strangely enough, they actually beat the Washington Justice with that. I think this is something that we mentioned last week, where we actually thought that, sticking to a particular roster for the Boston Uprising is probably the best move for them. And it seems like some of that might have actually been caused by the discord that Striker and like Marvel's issues as well were like pausing for the team and messing up the player rotations. I think you've seen whenever one of these top players creates such a ruckus in a team, it does actually mess up the team environment quite a lot. You could see this with the Dallas Fuel in season 3 when Decay had issues with the rest of the team. Uh, and that was evidenced later by people like Crimzo with his own tweets as well. I think that may be a good parallel to call back to, similar to what might be happening with Striker here, because there were definitely issues with the SF Shock, on that uh, tracer playtime sort of issue. And I think Striker may have been part of the root cause for that. And that might just be history repeating itself here. But I think in terms of just the outlook for the team itself, I think the Boston Uprising are probably genuinely better off, like actually having a set and like humble team that is working in a very coachable manner with the team staff. So I think while Striker has been a superstar in the past, uh, his season 4 performance wasn't exceptional, and even in this particular season, he did sometimes just get diffed by the enemy DPS and has not really shown that same consistency for almost 2 years now. So I'm not really sure if uh, you know giving into Striker's demands is the move here. So if the rumors actually turn out to be true, it might actually turn out to be a positive for the Boston Uprising. And if they can make these changes in time and the team is able to adapt to it, they might actually be able to sneak into even the kickoff clash, top 8 in the qualifiers. But that really depends on how quickly the team adjusts to the situation. Based off their recent win against the Washington Justice, though, I think it might genuinely be a good move for the Boston Uprising.
Yeah, I think just having kind of the root of any kind of conflict within the team is probably a good idea. I don't think they are going to be massively downgraded by having Strike out, because Victoria has shown some competency on the hit scan role, and Valentine is quite flexible as well. He too has had some good moments so far this season, so uh, I think it's also quite beneficial to have just a fixed starting DPS lineup and just have backups for the rest. And I think the Boston Uprising do have the flexibility within their two DPS to do that. So yeah, super interested to see what happens next. And I think if Striker's going to get a bad rap for this, it's going to be very difficult for him to join another team in the league. I don't think any kind of successful team would want him on the roster, just like any team that doesn't really care much for kind of bad publicity and is just desperate to get a few wins based off of some carry performances might sign striker, but I don't see it as a possibility right now. Okay then. I think let's move on to our week for predictions. There are two games in particular that we want to talk about. Uh, there are going to be a lot of interesting games in the APAC region, but we have just picked one for now, just because we don't that 12 matches and we don't really know at this point which ones are going to be the best ones. But we do think the very first one, which is the clash between the Seoul Dynasty and the Philadelphia Fusion, is going to be quite a banger because both teams are quite potent. So I think let's get into it and get your thoughts on this first night one.
Yeah, so I think Philly versus Seoul is a pretty good game to start us off on because uh, the Philly Fusion definitely look extremely strong, especially with that win against the Shanghai Dragons and then not really dropping a beat against the Guangzhou Charge either, which is quite reassuring because sometimes we can have these one-off performances, especially since Shanghai, I think for the past 2 years has always lost their first game, and then has gotten stronger over time. But here, I think you can see that the Philly Fusion is definitely onto something. MN3 is just extremely cracked on that DPS role, and Zest is also following up really well. I think Zest has actually been the player of the match for both times, and I think you can see that because of his really good flexibility, and he's been able to make consistently good plays, even if the resources are focused more onto MN3 at times. So I think the backline is actually doing a good job at kind of providing a balance between the two DPS. Uh, I also really like what they're doing with Belisroy and Fury. I think putting in Fury for the push is a good idea because Zarya is a pretty decent brawler and is able to take space with the threat of that bubble quite well. And I think that's a strategy that is working well for the Philly Fusion's particular playstyle, for taking space on push and just keeping on pushing that robot. And uh, I think one thing that you have to take care of in push, especially, is the fact that you can get picked off and then you lose your momentum. But the fact of the matter is that like Desire is able to provide an extreme amount of peel with that 200 HP bubble, so you're able to kind of defend your team from having that done to them. And so I think in that sense, the Philly Fusion coaching staff has got a really good grasp of the meta, I feel, where they're able to apply the right compositions in the right situations. And I think, along with their individual talent on the roster, it's just a winning combination for them. So, yeah, that's my thoughts on the Philly Fusion. And I think they're probably pretty well suited against the Seoul Dynasty. So, would you like to talk about the Seoul Dynasty in this matchup, or should I go on about the Seoul Dynasty as well?
Yeah, I think I can chip in because I do agree with everything you just said pretty much, and I do think the Fusion have the better chance of taking the series as well. I feel like both teams had similar levels of play, but the Fusion had those higher highs, and they hit those higher highs quite frequently. So I think you've covered the kind of the what makes the Fusion tick, right? Let me talk about the Soul Dynasty. Essentially, I think what the Soul Dynasty are going for this season is having a lot of like DPS firepower as they've always had, but just providing them with more resources, which I think they really needed to do. So you can see Prophet and Fitz getting a lot more space to work with. I think Smurf is doing a great job at that. His Winston has been really good this season, as it has always been in the past as well. He's also doing a great job on Zarya, surprisingly. He needs to improve a little bit at that hero and just be a bit more consistent. But for someone who has just been playing main tank for their entire career, he's doing a bang on job on Zarya as well. And what's so great with this team is the communication, which I think Vindheim is kind of pulling off. He seems to be kind of a like shot caller for the team in some ways as a main support can be, and Vindheim is also doing a great job at peeling for creative. Like his boops, especially if you watch any kind of Reaper going for their backline, Vindheim is always present to boop the Reaper away from the Ana, so that then the Ana can land a defensive nade or like sleep the Reaper, and then the team can finish them off. And just in general, like he's either peeling or you can see him going for those duels and finishing off targets. So he's playing really well and proactively, which is quite good for someone with like not a lot of experience playing main support and not a lot of experience in professional Overwatch as well compared to a lot of the other players. And naturally, you've also got the duo of Prophet and Fitz absolutely popping off in every game. Like, we've seen some incredible showings on the Widowmaker from Fitz as well. He has also, like, shown a lot of good soldier gameplay. He eventually does pull out that Sombra, which has been a little bit. Uh, I don't. I don't know what to say about that. It's just quite inconsistent and honestly not the right pick for the meta, as Avril has kind of told us a lot of times on stream. But he and Prophet are doing a fantastic job. Like you can see Prophet back to his usual like carry level self, playing the tracer, absolutely carrying fights, picking players off, and just doing an amazing job in general. So I think that with just a little bit more cohesion, this team can do better. But I think they'll still fall short against the Fusion because their DPS are just at another like a whole different level right now, and they do seem to be like a more cohesive team. I also want to mention that the Soul Dynasty should not at all feel Stalker. Like they fielded him for I think one map, and Stalker just played probably the worst Overwatch I've seen this season from a singular player. So I really hope they don't do that. And this could be just like a 3-2 win for the Fusion, I think. What about you?
I think you're definitely right about Stalker, where I don't really see him being a very important part of the team. I think it's good to experiment here and there at the beginning of the season, but I think over time you really just want to put Profit and Fitz in, because Profit can essentially do whatever you require Stalker to do, but at a much higher level. And I think one of the main difference makers between the Philly Fusion and the Soul Dynasty might actually be the fact that the Philly Fusion has sort of got Carpe as their third man, whereas Soul have got Stalker as their third man, and Stalker doesn't provide that much value to the team. Uh, they're they also like have two very distinct tank play styles, and the fact that they understand which tank is required on which map. Uh, is like a good sign from the Philly Fusion. Obviously, Smurf can make mid-map adjustments if he's trained on both those roles, but he's currently struggling, I think, to still pick up the Zarya. He's able to make really good plays when he's charged up and gets nanos and other resources. Like on a mechanical level, Smurf was actually quite surprisingly good. Uh, despite my lauding him in general as well, he did quite well on the Zarya mechanically. However, you can see that the team wasn't really working very well around that Zarya thing, but Smurf wasn't able to make individual plays, but rather had to work on that more peel-oriented play style. And I think that's probably one of the weaker aspects of this team. Alongside that, I feel like Creative has still not really been making plays. Vindime definitely has. Uh, I feel like, despite it almost feeling like sacrilege to say, considering Aim God's performance in the past, I think the Philly backline might just be a little more solid uh, overall, especially in the flex support department compared to the Soul Dynasty. And those are just a couple of factors why I'd probably go for the Philly Fusion over the Soul Dynasty currently. These Ash picks are all also not giving me a lot of hope so far. I think Fitz is definitely doing his best work on that soldier. Uh, and I think maybe with just a little more reinforcements uh, in terms of providing Smurf with better help to improve individually and improving overall team cohesiveness and not fielding Stalker that much. The Soul Dynasty have the opportunity to take this match, but the Philly Fusion already have all those cards sorted for them. So yeah, I think this should be a win for the Philly Fusion.
All right. And I think let's move on and talk about our second game because we can go on and on about this. And let's talk about the match on day 4 between the Atlanta Rain and the LA Gladiators. We do think this is probably going to be the most competitive match in the NA region next week, and also the kind of the highest level of play that we are going to see next week from NA. So yeah, just initial thoughts, Nightwing. Which seems like the better team to you, and kind of what do they have over the other team that's gonna help them get the win?
I think currently it feels like the Atlanta Rain is on a slight downward trend almost, uh, because while they did obviously like 3 of the Vancouver Titans, that's nothing to really write home about. And their other match recently is where they sort of beefed it, I feel, where in week 2 they lost to the Washington Justice 3-0. And that's extremely sad, honestly, because the Washington Justice recently lost 3-1 to the Boston Uprising. So if you try to use that logic, the Atlanta Rain are like down in the trenches uh, in terms of like initial power rankings. Uh, I think the Atlanta Rain are sort of getting that confidence back after beating down on the Vancouver Titans. Uh, and the fact of the matter is that the LA Gladiators' mental also has to be shattered a little bit after getting reverse swept twice in a very short amount of time. Uh, so I think it's really just about who has their mental less shattered in recent history. And I think it may just be the LA Gladiators because you saw some really high level gameplay from them where they almost swept the SF Shock last week, and they should probably be able to clutch it out. I think they're doing a great job with their DPS rotations. Uh, I still feel like Patafan has a little bit of a way to go, and I think that's one of the weaker factors for this team. However, I hope that that improves over time, and he's able to integrate with the team a little bit better over time with all the veterans around him. Uh, that's really my only hope for the LA Gladiators. Whereas I think with the Atlanta Rain, them integrating Nero in their most recent, not Nero, them integrating Venom in their most recent match to play the Tracer. It was a good move. You could see some genuinely good performances from Venom. I think them rounding out all the pieces of the roster before Speedily comes in, of course, is a good move for the Atlanta Rain. Uh, and now that they've got Venom also warmed up to play at a league level, uh, they're also in a good position to provide some of the best gameplay that they can. So I think this is going to be a really close match. I would personally give it to the LA Gladiators, but I think there's definitely a lot of potential for the Atlanta Rain to take this because I feel like to some degree the Atlanta Rain is actually more solid in terms of setting up positions, keeping that momentum going, and not losing players randomly. Whereas I feel like the LA Gladiators are sort of relying a little bit more on individual skill where I'm not totally sold on Reiner's performance as a tank player either so far yet, because I feel like sometimes he's just the one that's getting diffed, if I'm being honest. I also like a lot of the different like styles shown by the Atlanta Rain. I still think Hawk's Doomfist is very salvageable in the case that you're able to shut down the enemy Ana, even if it is Shu on the enemy team. So yeah, I think there's just a lot of variables to consider here, but I would overall give it to the LA Gladiators by a slight margin.
Hmm. I do agree with the points you've made. I think the like what's going to determine how this match goes is primarily going to be the Gladiators' consistency, because I think they fall behind the Atlanta Rain on that front. I feel like the Gladiators overall have had a higher ceiling this season, but the Rain have been a little bit more consistent. I don't like. I do acknowledge the fact that they've lost to the Washington Justice, which was honestly quite a shock to me as well because I thought they would sweep the Justice. But I think other than that, they have a lot of their stuff figured out. Um, I think that they probably have some of the most disciplined team play that I've seen in the league. You can always see the team engaging along with the tank. Like if they, no matter if they're playing the Winston comps or the Doomfist comps, the team is never out of position. They're always engaging together. You never see Kai taking up any ridiculous positions and getting picked off on the Soldier 76. You also see like really consistent showings from Nero and even Venom, who played quite an impressive tracer in their previous match. And the backline is just super solid with OG and Ultraviolet. Like I think as soon as we saw Ultraviolet playing the Ana, like this season, we were instantly impressed with by his level of play. I don't think he has any kind of shortcoming on that hero. Like he's been landing some ridiculous sleeps, and all in all, it's just a pretty scary roster to go up against. The Gladiators do have a lot of good pieces as well, but like Nightwing mentioned, they are relying a lot more on individual plays and team play, and I think that that's what could be the undoing in this matchup. I think my opinion will change based on how the Atlanta Rain do against the London Spitfire, whom they're going up against on day 3 of next week. Um, but all in all, I do think that the Rain have a better chance at taking this series. It's honestly quite a toss up. Like because if the Gladiators play consistently, I think they can beat the Rain. But overall, I do think that the kind of disciplined play style that the Rain have, and like the team play is going to kind of outplay the individual showings that the Gladiators kind of rely on for their wins. So it's the Rain for me. It's the Gladiators for Nightwing, and it's it's going to be an interesting game for sure. So any additional comments about this game, Nightwing, or should we close things up?
I think it's just going to be interesting to see probably things like the Widow matchup between Hans and Kai. If you see maps like Gibraltar or Circuit Royale, that's something to look out for. I I want to see good performances from either Gator or Reiner as well. I think that head-to-head matchup is really interesting, especially considering that Reiner probably looked a little bit more solid on the Winston in terms of primal mechanics. Uh, in that match against the Shock, even if the Shock were able to turn it around. Against a traditionally main tank player like Gator, I'm hoping that it's a closer match, and if Reiner is able to still come out on top, you might even peg him as one of the best like main tank players in the NA region, outside of maybe Fearless. So I think there's just a lot of different matchups that are going to happen. Rookie flex supports versus established, almost legendary flex supports. Uh, there's a really good main support matchup. There's a really good matchup on basically every single role where you've got just a bunch of different players that are going head to head here. So it's going to be probably the highest level of Overwatch you're going to see this week, especially in the NA region, but arguably even compared to the APAC region. But I think it remains to be seen which region is actually stronger. That's something we'll find out in the mid-season tournament. So yeah.
All right. I think on that note, we can end this episode. Thanks a lot for listening, guys. We do appreciate the support. Uh, do let us know if you would like us to discuss anything else in addition to just our predictions, winners, losers, and the news. We are just going with this approach for now. We don't really know if you guys would like us to talk about anything else, so let us know in the comments, and you can even join our Discord, which I will link in the description below. And we just like have some watch parties, socialize, I guess, because this is the extent to which we as ambiverts kind of socialize. But we do hope you can join us there, and we will see you next week, where we will talk about how week 4 went and start talking about the kickoff clash tournament, which will be pretty interesting. So bye bye, and we'll see you then.